This is now part 3 of lecture 1 about Michael Sandel's justice. Here we're finally getting to moral theories. The first one is utilitarianism, and it is based on consequences and happiness. The second one is virtue ethics, and it is based on character and happiness. These are two different ways to think about happiness. One is consequence-based, the other is character-based. In consequence-based thinking about happiness, the basic thought is that happiness is the pleasure and enjoyment that we get as a consequence of actions. Whereas character-based happiness is the idea that person is happy due to the character they have, not due to the outcomes of their actions, but the character of the person itself, the traits of that character make person live a happy life. We will see how this works out. These character traits are called virtues. And so in the discussion of virtue ethics, the key distinction is between personal virtue versus public or civic virtue. And personal virtue is in relation to personal happiness, while public or civic virtue is in relation to societal happiness. All right, let's see how it all pans out. From the objections to price gouging, we confirm that welfare and freedom are indeed the two dominant moral values on which moral debates depend. Additionally, we learn that measuring welfare of actions depends on measuring and comparing their consequences. Are more people benefited than harmed or not? Right? Because there was an argument that price gouging reduces welfare since it hurts or harms more people than it benefits. This is the right time to introduce the first of the two or three major moral theories. Utilitarianism is the first major moral theory we will discuss. The example of price gouging is at the beginning of chapter 1, while utilitarianism is the topic of the entire chapter 2. So we're sort of skipping ahead of ourselves and dipping into chapter 2 here. According to utilitarianism, gauging whether an action is moral or not requires looking at its consequences. Gauging consequences means gauging how much suffering and how much happiness an action produces. Moral actions maximize happiness and minimize suffering for as many living beings as possible. Utility is the difference between happiness and suffering that an action produces. Say an action A raises benefits to 5 people and suffering that an act say an action A raises benefits to 5 people and produces harms to 3 people, while action B benefits 5 people while harming 2. In this case, the utility of action A is +2. 5 minus 3 equals 2, while utility of action B is +3. 5 minus 3 equals 2. In this case, our moral judgment tells us that action B is the better action as it produces more utility. That's utilitarianism. There are a number of assumptions in utilitarianism. Assumption 1, happiness or pleasure and suffering or pain are the ultimate factors for living beings. An action is good insofar as it results in happiness or pleasure. An action is bad insofar as it results in suffering or pain. So assumption 1 is that happiness and suffering are basically pleasure and pain. and that happiness and suffering is what worth of actions is all about. Assumption two, equal happiness and suffering of different persons have the same importance. For this reason, we are able to do the kind of calculation we did above with action A and action B. Of course, subjectively speaking, my happiness and suffering matter to me more than yours does. But that is my subjective bias from the moral standpoint. Objectively speaking, each person has the same moral importance, or rather, their happiness and suffering do, as utilitarians will explain to us. We have thus deepened our discussion of welfare as the ultimate moral value by introducing ourselves to utilitarianism. Welfare emerges as a value from within this kind of utilitarian thinking that we all do, that is captured by this theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was articulated by two British philosophers in the middle of the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. We will say more about the significance of the contribution of each of these two philosophers shortly. We are not at this time going deeper into the second ultimate moral value, freedom. It will be the topic of lectures to come, more precisely chapters 3, 5, and perhaps 6. We are, however, going to briefly introduce a third ultimate moral value, virtue. It is the basis of the third objection to price gouging. Remember, the first objection to price gouging was on the basis of welfare. The second was on the basis of freedom. And now we're introducing a third objection to price gouging on the basis of virtue. The third objection to price gouging is that it is greedy. Greed is a vice, the opposite of virtue. What is the virtue that greed is the opposite of? It's hard to think of a word that pinpoints it, but let us say provisionally that it is some kind of a right combination of moderation, decency, self-restraint, and generosity, as is appropriate to circumstances. Those would all be virtues that are the opposite of the vice of greed. And those are the kinds of things that make our character produce happiness in our lives. Moderation, decency, self-restraint, generosity. There are two kinds of virtue, personal virtue and civic virtue. Personal virtue is attitudes and dispositions and qualities of a person's character on which a happy life depends. Civic virtue is attitude and dispositions and qualities of a person's character on which a good society depends. The origin of virtue ethics is usually traced to an ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle, who articulated philosophy of virtue somewhere in the 3rd century BCE. Aristotle wrote quite a bit about both personal virtue as well as civic virtue. With regard to personal virtue, we would think about the kind of combination of moderation, decency, self-restraint, and generosity that a person would need in order to live a good and happy life. With regard to civic virtue, we would think about the kind of combination of moderation, decency, self-restraint, and generosity that a person would need in order to make a good society actual? So these civic virtues are not really about a single person, but about all of the persons in the society. About the virtue that all of the persons in the society must have in order for that society to be a good society. That's public or civic virtue. Sandel does not want to discuss personal virtue. He takes it that, in the modern context, each individual must choose their own idea of a good and happy life, and that what counts as virtue depends upon that choice. This take on personal virtue is due to importance placed on freedom in modern life. So Sandel takes it that a moral objection to price gouging as greed is not on the basis of personal virtue, but is rather on the basis of civic or public virtue. The objection to price gouging is on the basis of an understanding of civic virtue. Here is the clue that Sandel offers to us as a part of the essence of a good society, in which therefore persons have civic virtue. In times of trouble, persons in a good society pull together. Accusation of greed directed at the store owners who price gouge accuses them of lacking in civic virtue that makes it actual for everyone in society to help each other out in times of trouble. In a society where greed is spread, persons don't help each other in times of trouble. And a good society is one in which persons help each other in times of trouble. Persons who practice price gouging do not act with civic virtue and undermine, by example and by adding to suffering, civic virtue in society. What we observe in the price gouging example is a clash of the three moral principles based on three moral values: welfare, freedom, and virtue. Sandel invites us to think in an informed manner about and decide which of these moral values is most important in the context of emergencies and disasters, with regard to price gouging, but also more generally